Today, I'm joined by Laurie Mazan, who's the co-founder, president, and chief coaching officer of Sounding Board. Now, Laurie has spent 25 years as an executive coach working with C-suite executives at major organizations like Citibank and Chevron, and she's also worked extensively with smaller companies as well, including startups. She's the author of a really interesting new book called Leadership Revolution: The Future of Developing Dynamic Leaders. And we're going to talk about some of the themes in that book today. So, welcome to the podcast, Laurie.
Here, Paul. Nice to be here.
So, I think one of the interesting aspects of the book is you're kind of using the structure of a leadership coaching series of sessions, as it were, to give insights in how the world of work is changing. And now we're both old enough to have seen a lot of change in work environments. I
Yeah.
feel like the how, the what, the when, the why of work, um, even the where, I suppose. What do you think have been some of the most impactful changes in work and work environments in, say, the last 25 years?
I would say that the lack of homogeneity in the workforce is the biggest thing. Like, if you look back in the 1970s, 80s, even 60s, when a lot of leader development tools were being created, it was primarily a white male environment. And who were the leaders? White males. So everything was kind of geared towards that. And now you look, and maybe it hasn't changed as much as one would hope, but there is a lot more diversity, gender, ethnic, cultural diversity in the workforce that wasn't there when all of these tools were designed. And in addition to that, or kind of related to it, there's also many more generations in the workforce now than there was back in the 70s, 80s, in the last century. So just the different thinking of the various generations creates a lot more diversity than there was previously. I think the second thing, of
Yeah.
course, is just technology too, the dramatic change in technology.
Yeah, I mean, that is a theme that kind of comes through in the book quite a bit, and it's something we've actually discussed a reasonable amount on this podcast. This historical image of a leader is really embedded in a very, I think, particular view. Like, still to this day, I bet if you asked people to name CEOs through history, they'd be coming up with names like, I don't know, Henry Ford, Jack Welch, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, maybe Elon Musk now, right? And
Yes.
all of them
Yes.
have a very specific, they're all white men
Yep.
with
Yep.
domineering characters
Of a
and
certain age.
of a certain age. And what constitutes traditional leadership kind of reinforces that, right?
100%. And the even the literature around research from that era is all, I call it a 5 trait research. Like, here's 5 traits you need to have if you're going to be a successful leader, and it's traits from that style of leader. One thing I think has been very interesting, we mentioned Steve Jobs because he's been held up as a successful leader.
Mm-hmm.
I actually did a lot of work with Apple in the early days, and so had a little of the inside view. And I think it came out later. Maybe he wasn't as successful in some ways as one might have
Uh-huh.
thought. But I think having a different leader at the top of the organization for the last, what, now 10, 15 years, that has a very different style, but is still very successful, kind of debunks that idea that you have to be that domineering or that highly visible, highly, dramatic style of CEO to be successful.
So let's get into the concept of what even a leader is then. So what do you think of when you say leader? Do you think it's a job role?
Oh, I definitely do not think it's a job role. Um, Only it can be a job role, but remember, you could have that positional authority and not be a very good leader, right? You couldn't
Hmm.
just be self serving, or you could be really more in the manager level and not leading. So I have a really simple definition of a leader, which is a leader is someone other people want to follow.
Mm.
Okay. And that means, ideally a leader would be doing something more in the greater good, but we can see even from politics today, you can be a leader, it may not be positive, and yet people want to follow you. It's still leadership.
Yeah. And so status, as it were, and a job title can provide a little piece of that, but only a little piece of that, right?
That's right. That's right. That's I call that a named leader. Someone is naming you a leader because of your titling, but that is not the kind of leadership necessarily that others want to follow. And that's why any employee in an organization or in a community can be a leader. If you are operating in a way where other people are following you, you're a leader.
Yeah. A bit interestingly in the book, a bit of an aha moment for me came when you connected a lot of this to how we measure and grow talent. There's a small piece in the book where I think it's called "Putting People into Boxes,"
Yes.
and it gently but precisely critiques the McKinsey 9-box talent review.
Yes.
I'd love you to, for people that don't use it or haven't heard of it, can you explain a little bit what the 9-box talent review is
Oh,
and the
sure.
challenges that there are with it?
Yes, so that's a tool, an HR tool that's been used really since I think it came out in the 70s, 80, 90. I forget the exact
Yeah.
year now. And the idea was to use that to determine who are your highest potential leaders. And it's a grid. On one side is your job performance, one axis, and the other axis is your potential. And then the people with the highest job performance and the highest potential are the ones that you are supposed to put all your attention, time, and money on. The problem with that is potentials like an internal to the individual quality. So, how is potential being determined? And there's no guidance around that in the 9 box, and yet that's the one of the two key characteristics. So what has happened is potentials being determined by people who have an idea of that for themselves, which
Hmm.
might be biased or narrow or egocentric, and then are applying that to an entire workforce, because often this subjective quality of potential is really determined by a conversation among higher level
Hmm.
executives, and that is one of the reasons we haven't gotten as much diversity in the workplace as we might have if the view of potential either was widened or visible or more objective or more stated, than it is in the 9 box approach. And I there that 9 box approach has been debunked repeatedly in
Hmm.
research, and yet I find companies every day that use that as the basis of their leader development programs.
Yeah, we do as well, and there's a couple of points that I would add to it. I think that there is all the flaws that you mentioned. There's another flaw as well, which is that, it kind of works on the assumption that not only are managers free of bias, which of course they're not, where none of us are free of bias,
No?
um, but also it relies on the idea that managers are all equally motivated to grow the people under them. And in
Yes.
reality, what we've seen when we've taken more holistic looks at high potential programs, regardless of whether they use the 9 box system or not, is that the people that grow
Mm,
inside organizations are typically the people that are managed by people who believe in growing their people. And
right.
and that varies a lot inside organizations, right? If you've
Yes.
got managers without a lot of those leadership traits, if you've got managers, as you highlight in the book, that haven't really made the transition from being an individual contributor to actually growing their teams, right,
Others.
and growing
Yes.
others, right, and are not
Mhm.
motivated by the idea of growing others, then that
Mhm.
doesn't just affect the team performance, it affects the ability of the people in the team to thrive as individuals and participate in high potential programs and so on. So the
Yeah.
whole system is centered around really an idea that every manager wants to believes in growing their people and knows how to grow their people and is gonna spend that extra bit of time to grow their people. So
The
it's a real
capacity
challenge and the
and the
capacity. Yes.
skills to actually do that.
Hmm.
Very interesting that you should target that because the organization I have, Sounding Board, we have recently over the last maybe year and a half really targeted in on the manager.
Hmm.
Because yes, there's lots of HR programs, and some of those can be really valuable,
Hmm.
but on a day to day basis, it's really the manager that's the key to the growth of the employee.
Yeah.
And as the work environment has changed and employees want more impact, they want more um, individualized treatment, they want more development, they want faster development. The only way that can happen is if managers really step up and facilitate that growth. And so much of the programming either is individual, like go on your skills platform and take a class,
Hmm.
or it's HR driven. So it's programmatic. So maybe a high potential program or something, but there's a whole crowd of people in the middle that aren't getting a lot of attention around their leadership growth, their functional growth, their personal growth that could be from their manager if those managers were in a place to do that with their skills, capacities, tools, etc. And
Yeah.
I think it's a trend, right? Because back in the early days, like of my career, you said we've been around the block a few times. It was the manager's job to grow an employee, and then it kind of switched over to everybody's, for themselves. So now you have to manage your own career. But we found that what that has led to is people leaving companies really rapidly,
Yep.
and a tenure of only like 2-3 years at a company. So my kind of forward looking thing is we're starting to swing back on the pendulum a little bit, where it really is the manager and the employee's job together to grow that employee so that they are retained by the company, they're advancing in their impact, in their skill set, in their professional growth, and that actually serves everybody.
Yeah, I love part of again a theme I kind of get from the book is sort of how related this is to a mindset that needs to be instilled in managers and leaders. So,
Hmm.
when you have these managers, as you often do inside companies where the tenure is like 2-3 years, I think you point out in the book the average is like 4.1 years now or something like that, but very low,
Yep.
right? And very
Yeah.
very different. It's another change that, of course, has happened, right? The jobs for
Right.
life are really gone now, and so we have
They
these
really
these
are.
much shorter tenures, right?
Hmm.
And so you end up potentially in sort of a vicious circle where managers don't think their employees are going to be with them for very long. They themselves have gone from being an IC, individual contributor, to a manager pretty quickly. They haven't necessarily received the coaching or the skills development that they need in order to do it well. And their mindset, you point this out several times, is centered around the well, I can do. I don't. I'd have to teach this person how to do this. I can do it faster than they can. It'll take me longer to tell them how to do it than to actually have them do it. And so they end up becoming what, in my case, in Microsoft, when I worked at Microsoft, we called them super ICs, right? Where basically
Yes,
they just
exactly.
all they did when they became a manager was work harder, right? And that was it. And
Right,
they just sort of
right.
put in additional hours, and then they had these people that work for them. In many cases, they didn't even really respect the people that work for them very much because they're like, well, I can just do it
Yep,
better myself. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm in this role.
yep,
And then it was perpetuated this sort of like, we'll create a superhero, we'll turn this superhero into a manager, and then we'll load a bunch of administrative stuff on top of the manager.
Yep.
Until you shift that mindset to the point whereby your job is to maximize the potential of your team, and you will be measured on how you maximize the potential of that team.
Yes. Yeah.
Until you do that, then everything that you do in terms of growing the people under you is just going to be what you do with any spare capacity and kind of out of the goodness of your heart, right? And that is where
Agreed.
I think a lot of it breaks down.
Well, I
So
just heard this
go ahead.
stat. Like I just heard this stat yesterday, which is for individuals that are promoted from individual contributor to manager. They do not receive any management training on an average
Hmm.
for 5 years after they are promoted.
Wow.
So they're
Wow.
promoted and
Whereby a bunch
struggling,
of them
and
have
it's
already gone, right?
yeah, because look, that model you talked about, that's going to lead to burnout right away. Like who
Hmm.
that's not sustainable over time. So then people leave, so they just keep the wheel turning to fill that role. But those people never advance to actually be a manager versus a super IC. I really love that term. So
Yeah.
that's like, and taking some skills training and that kind of thing doesn't do it, because it's a fundamental shift in mindset if you are doing the work yourself versus you are facilitating others to do the work.
So that leads us actually neatly into one of the really interesting, I guess, frameworks that you have in the book. You talk about skills, capabilities, and capacity. So tell me more about how those build upon each other.
Yeah, it is like a building block model. So skills, that's
Hmm.
what we've been training since OSHA came into effect, and really
Hmm.
starting primarily around 1970s. There's nothing wrong with skills. We're constantly talking about upskilling, reskilling, all of that. But skills are fundamental to the job function, but they're just not enough for leadership development. So we say there's another level, we call it capacities, which is blending those skills together to create a larger impact. And that takes a different kind of development, and it takes transfer to your actual job daily work so that you can apply it in a contextual way. So the biggest problem with basic skill training is the transfer of learning is like 10% or less. People actually
Yeah.
maybe get some ideas, but the transfer to their daily life is very low. In the capacity level, now you can have more transfer because it's more effective. You're combining a sets of skills to have a greater impact. And then the one above that really is capacity. And that is how to apply those sets. I mean, yeah, capacity. That's how to apply those capabilities in context, in the moment, in an environment that's unpredictable, predictable or unknown or volatile or rapidly changing. Like those
Hmm.
basic skill sets, that's really not going to help you when suddenly you're faced with a pandemic or the market drops out from under your business or something else. You need a higher level functioning to be able to handle the environment that we're currently in, where there's so much unpredictable and unknownness about it.
Yeah, I find this utterly fascinating because it kind of reflects the journey that we're on. So we began as a training, kind of like pure training organization. We found much the same things that you found in your work. It's like people in quotes learn it, then they either worst case scenario they forget it, but certainly they haven't figured out how to apply it.
Yeah.
And we've been like when we started, I would say we were something like 90% of our focus was on like transferring knowledge, and now 70% of our focus is on how the knowledge and the skills get applied. And it's so
Yes.
interesting how in kind of traditional skills development there is so much attention paid to, I would say, almost like optimizing and streamlining how you, in quotes, deliver training. Like, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
for a book or a guy that comes and does an offsite or something along those lines. And
Right.
so little attention paid to optimizing the process of taking knowledge and transferring it into a set of repeatable behaviors that can be used in a variety of different circumstances, like you're talking. So it's like we need to. I completely agree with you that coaching needs to take a much more significant role to allow people to understand that. And then also, I think we need to, like, for those of us that are still in kind of like the skills transfer world and the skills development world, we need to be measuring and focusing on what is happening 2 months later or 6 months later or 1 year later, and how is that translating
100%.
into a set of capabilities and
Yeah.
capacities. So just
And
love
almost
love
having
love
some,
that you're highlighting that.
yes, and maybe some follow-up about that helps people make that transfer.
Yeah.
Because I started also in the training industry, and the thing I was struck by even back then is people would want to spend the, second, back then we did in person, day long training or a couple day
Hmm.
long training. But the key questions would always be, but wait, this is all good, but how do I do it in my environment
Yeah.
with my boss? In this circumstance with this difficult person, and they needed that support to translate the learning to their particular environment. And I think coaching is a very good way to do that. There's others, I'm sure you all do other ways to that help that. And then the measurement helps how much of that transferred. And if it wasn't enough to really make that valuable, well, let's go back in and be like, hey, it's been 2 months. Like, what are you actually using from this? What could you use? What's blocking you? And applying a coaching mindset to that can be useful, because the idea is people don't change their behavior and maintain that behavior over time unless they change their thinking or their mindset. So we're in January, like the gym, everybody knows about the gym. Like,
Yeah.
okay, we're all going to
Yeah.
change our behavior and go to the gym. But in March, the gym is empty because we didn't change our thinking about that. So having like a follow-up sessions, like we have some programs where there's a training and then we have group coaching or peer group coaching afterwards to try to help people get their mind around, how do I need to think differently so that I can actually use this skill, capacity, capability on a regular daily basis. And when the thinking and the behavior lines up together, now you don't have that cognitive dissonance, and so it sticks.
Yeah, just to illustrate how you can move beyond skills to true capacity. I Several times in the book you bring up lessons that you've learned from your practice in Tai Chi, which I understand that you've been doing
Yeah.
for decades now. By the
Yeah.
way, that was something that I also found really interesting because I know nothing about Tai Chi. So before the end of the book, I was like watching videos of it and things like that. I was like, oh,
Oh,
that's different to
fantastic.
my, like done at a high level. That's quite different to what I imagined. So you've got me interested in that. Really appreciate it.
Oh, great.
But you do use a good example in the book. I'm not sure if you can remember it, which really illustrates how you move beyond skills to true capacity using Tai Chi as an example. So, can you talk about that a little bit more?
Oh my gosh, I don't know exactly which example you're referring to, but I'll say it like this, and you tell me if I got it. The
That's
way
all right.
Tai
That
Chi
sounds good.
works, for folks on there, the Tai Chi is that like sort of slow movement calisthenics you see people doing in a park, often elderly people. But it
Hmm.
also has a martial format, and that includes a version of sparring. So you have a class and you're learning movements and that kind of thing, which are skills, right? You're a certain aligned to skills, a certain way of moving, a certain way of stepping, whatever it is. But then you go and you apply this in a sparring situation, which is live, interactive, has emotion, has force involved, and the skill that you thought you had that you were showing in class, you like just evaporates in the face of this live interaction. And so the idea is to keep going back and forth between this skill development and then the live interactions, so that you start to develop your capacity to apply these skills in a situation that may be, physically, emotionally, mentally, intellectually challenging for you. Because in the face of those forces, the skill set tends to drop off. And, hopefully you're not doing something physical at work, but when someone's challenging your long held idea at work, and all your skills fall away and you just get mad and argue with them, that's not probably your best, approach to the situation. So that really, that, transfer of learning from a single skill to being able to use that in an interactive, challenging environment is the key factor.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I thought to me it was fascinating because you discuss a little example of where you might be in one of those sessions that you're talking about, and you've got a set of movements that you would do in like a certain order, and then suddenly something shifts, and you don't even know why you did it, and your opponent even doesn't really know why you did it, but it worked, right? And
Yeah.
then also use that example of like, okay, so somebody comes up to you in the street and looks you in a funny way, or somebody comes up to you in the street and is going to attack you. Those are different types of responses that you need, and you need the capacity to be able to use those skills in that situation in the right way.
Yes, and
That
the
is very
sort,
different to
right?
the idea of like
Yeah.
learning this and then learning this and then learning this. They're
Hmm.
connected. Obviously, you must if you haven't got those skills, you can't apply them. But if you do have those skills and you have the ability to be able to apply them in different circumstances in different ways, then it's a very different type of scenario. It almost reminds me of
Yeah, that.
jazz in a way.
Oh, it is like that. Actually, there's a book I
Mm.
love. It's called Free Play, and it's about jazz
Mhm.
improvisation. And it really
Mm.
is how do you take your skills and make sure that what you're playing in an improvisational manner actually sounds good and isn't discordant and, unhappy on the ear. So, same idea, because there's an assessment you're doing, like, oh my gosh, here's the situation. What from all of my sets of skills do I need to apply here? What's the intensity of that? What's actually going to work in this situation with this person in this environment? And that sense of judgment is very difficult to develop. And I think sort of the traditional skills training was for a more predictable environment. So it did have, for, A, then B, then C. But anybody who works with people, especially nowadays, like, you try A and then they do something totally different, and B now is not going to make sense at all. So what do? You have to have a much wider range of skills to draw from to be able to, uh, you know, respond in a more unpredictable situation.
It's funny this when you start talking about this and sort of the nature of what companies are, and just how different they are. I mean, just how unstructured and ambiguous they are, and how the workday is completely different for many people, and it starts at any time and ends at any time, and how the people in the workplace are so different to what they used to be. You tell a great story early on where you showed up in a lavender suit, and you're still wearing a suit, wearing one of your three suits, and it looked great, but it wasn't the right color suit, and so you weren't supposed to stay at that company, right? So much of that stuff has changed. Like we say, the what, the when, the where, the how, the how, the why. All of these things have changed. So much of that has changed. So many the people that are in the workforce are there for such a shorter period of time. The nature of what companies are doing as a whole has changed so much, and yet we still we're still relying on many of these old systems, as it were, many of which were never even proven at the time, which is really
I
interesting,
know.
but just became
I
like
know.
commonly
They
formed
just came
practices.
popular.
Yeah,
Yes, yes, kind of,
they just became popular
kind of
because
like
they were a way
TikTok.
of simplifying. Exactly. Yes. Right. It's not necessarily a force
Yes.
for good, but it's become popular, right?
Yeah.
And so, to me, that links into another theme in the book that we talk a lot on about the podcast: the nature of what a company itself is. And you talk about three. basic models. You don't name all of them, but basically you talk about this kind of like all business approach whereby, which still exists, where
Mhm.
all the employees are kind of like pawns and you move them in and out and you hire a bunch of them, you fire a bunch of them, and they're not humans really. They're just entities that are doing work objects. Then you have that an approach that focuses on belonging, and then you have an approach that focuses on community. And I noticed that you come out really firmly on the side of a community focused approach. I find this fascinating. I've actually been involved in a lot of discussions about this myself recently. As I
Oh.
say, you come out really firmly on the side of community. I'd love you to explain why you do that and what the
Mhm.
differences are between those different approaches.
Okay, good. That thinking is maybe a little bit controversial, but
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned my work trajectory. I actually trained as a therapist and started my career as a social worker in my early years. And my perception around the idea of belonging is that is really an emotional quality or capacity that people develop in their childhood. And I think it's a big request to ask a company to provide that for employees, especially given belonging is based in the idea of unconditional love. And
Mm-hmm.
not just naturally, the work environment is conditional. It's not unconditional. You do your job, you may get kudos. You don't do your job, it's conditional on how or what or how people perceive you doing your job. So it's not an unconditional situation, and yet we're using language that has to do with unconditional love. And I think there may have been some good reasons for that in terms of DEI and how to make
Mm-hmm.
that visible. But I use the term community because I feel like it gets to a lot of the same ideas from a diversity perspective as belonging does, but it doesn't put the onus only on the organization. The organization is part of that, but the individuals are part of the community as well. And you can just see from social media, people really just have a huge desire to be part of a community. I think it's just a natural desire of humans. And being part of community, you feel accepted, right? If everyone's allowed in the community, you're accepted. You have exchange, you can create relationship, you can learn from those communities. You feel that sense of connection. And so having a community oriented approach at work, I think it works very well. And often you have already just community works well when you have common denominators, where you have common interest or
Mm-hmm.
values or some commonality. So in a work setting, you just have the basic commonality that you work at the same place, which is not a bad basis for starting a community. So I really advocate for the community approach versus belonging. I think belonging is very hard to create if people don't have an internal sense of that by the time they get to the workforce.
Yeah, I found this discussion really interesting. We've had a couple of DEIB folks on the podcast recently and gone into various different aspects of it. Um, what I found particularly interesting, though, was the sort of connection that you make between this concept of belonging and then the concept of family. And like
Yeah.
you, I've seen organizations that use terms that are similar to family terms when describing their organization. Bit of context I wanted to add about that is that in some of the discussions I've been having about this, quite reasonably, people have pointed out that actually, even the term family, we have this assumption that the term family is a universally positive thing. For many people, that's not the case, right? Some people grow
No.
up in highly dysfunctional families, right?
Yes.
Some the point about a family, a sort of an observation about a family, is that it's very difficult. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, right? It's very difficult to
Right.
leave it's very difficult to leave a family, no matter how
Yeah.
dysfunctional it is, right? And you have to put up
Right.
with a whole bunch of elements with that could be related to you personally. There can be even abusive situations in families, etc. And you just can't leave it, right?
Right.
Because it's in you, it's your blood, right? So, or at least it's very difficult to, right? So, opting in and out of that environment is not something that that many people can do. So even that for many people is just not like the right term in the first place. But
Yeah.
then secondly, as you point out, in a world in which we live today, right? People join communities based on shared purpose and shared interest. There may be a sense of belonging in that community, but
There may
that's
be.
that's if you like an attribute of the community, right? There may be the
Hmm.
community may be a welcoming community, and you may feel a sense of belonging. But in a functional community, you should be able to join that community, and you should be able to leave that community when the sense of when it's not aligning with your mission, or you've moved on, or whatever it would happen to be. And so I love the overall construct, which is one that sort of reflects the reality of it. And you point out, which I think is really intriguing, is that not only is there this idea that if you sort of center everything around the construct of family, can it be challenging in the moment for the company to keep up with that? But given the world in which we live, like what happens to the community once you start? What happens to the family, as it were, I should say, once you
Right.
start having to get rid of people, right?
Right.
Then it's a very
Right.
different situation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and in
And it's a
reality,
very
um,
awkward situation.
a
Yeah.
job is a job.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if
A
and
hundred
the other
percent.
thing, of course, as well, yeah. The other thing, of course, is as well is that and I think our companies often think that the closer and the deeper and the more embedded everybody is into the company, then the better value we'll get out of people. And you use that example of like the hand in front of the face, and not being able to see anything because everything is too close and too tight.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and I love that construct, because what you're really highlighting, I think, is the fact that it is, as well-meaning as all of this is, right? And centered around the idea of caring about the whole person and being there for people and all this kind of stuff. As well-meaning as it is, there can be a downside to it.
Oh, there's definitely a downside to it. I think companies can feel like if they create this sense of family and belonging, people won't leave. It was almost like a
Mm-hmm.
reaction to a lot of this, shortening lifespan of employees at a company. But I love your reference to Hotel California, because I do think it becomes a little like that. And just because people are still there doesn't mean they're doing their best work, because now they're like caught in the net. They are not having a choice about it. I found people do their
Mm-hmm.
best work when they choose to do their best work, which, if they're feeling trapped inside an organization, and one that potentially feels abusive or something, they are not doing their best work. So choosing to be part of a community of workers or employees or whatever, gives a lot more agency to the individual, which then gives a lot more potential for impactful work than that feeling of having to, being stuck, being trapped. um, and you have to know when it's that tight, like a percentage of those people don't feel like they belong. They feel like the awkward stepchild or something in there, and that doesn't go to productive work behavior either.
Yeah. Wow. Um, all right, let's finish up here. I'm really interested in the insights that you bring about how we go about measuring people. So early on in the book, you point out flaws in things like Myers Briggs, and then later discuss the importance of performance alignment between managers and employees. I think this is all interconnected, but I'd love to get your take on that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we are stuck in old style version of measurement. Especially
Hmm.
like when you look at skills, it's like, do you have it or not? It's a binary form of
Hmm.
measurement. We still love a Likert scale or a 10-point scale, that doesn't really reflect a lot of information. So I'm kind of suggesting we find some new ways of measurement. And one of the ways is more a gap analysis approach, which is, here's what we want and here's where we are and here's the gap. So how do we close that gap? And that I specifically identify that around performance evaluation. So that instead of just evaluating something in the past, that we're actually closing an alignment gap between the manager and their employee around their work
Mhm.
going forward. And so now it's like a way to actually create a plan. How do we close this gap? Versus if it's a point in time, evaluation. Okay, you were, meets expectation last year, exceeds expectation. It's very difficult to create something lively and growthful out of that conversation. So I think it's just a very a less evaluative way of thinking and a more creative, growing way of thinking, to think more of a gap analysis or a different way of measuring that's non-binary.
Well, Laurie, I think this actually is really vital now. We've done some research on our side to look at the delta between what employers are expecting and what the expectations of employees are expecting. And we've seen a widening of that delta that's happened over the
Mm,
relatively short period of time that we've been in existence, about 3 years. And I think that what's really interesting about what you're saying here is that in the absence of this type of gap analysis, it's extremely common for managers, particularly untrained managers, to think of, in quotes, lack of performance of their employees as being solely on the employee. Like, oh, I hired this guy who I thought was going to be amazing and isn't. And
yeah,
that's a failure of the employee, and not take their part of the ownership in
right,
that equation, right? You hired
right,
that employee for a reason. So either you're bad at hiring or you're bad at conveying your expectations, or you're bad at helping that employee grow into the role or something, right? But you have some
right.
measure of responsibility for the lack of performance of employees. And this gap analysis allows both sides of that equation to understand that there are two sides to that equation, and that they have
Right.
a role and that the other party has a
Right.
role. And I'm not surprised that it's popular, because it's quite different, right? It's quite a different way
It's
of
very different.
it's quite a
Yeah,
different way
people
of thinking
love the
about it.
conversation. So
Mhm.
much of performance and evaluation, and as we said before, potential is based on perception. It's not the reality. It's what somebody has dreamed up in their own head and is now measuring by. And these kinds of gap analysis and alignment conversations just make those measuring sticks visible. So, for
Yeah.
example, we have in our model, we have a one question like, I knew what to do to be successful in my job. And we asked the
Mhm.
manager, my employee knew what to do to be successful in the job. Just that, the gap on that is shocking, where the manager will often feel 100% the employee knew what to do, and the employee will be like 40%. Right. So right there, just saying, oh, I thought you knew what you were supposed to be doing. And the employee is saying, no, I didn't. Um, and saying like, well, so how do we make sure you do for this year? Right there, now you have a generative conversation. And
Yeah.
surprisingly, it goes the other way. The employee
Mm.
will say 100% I knew what to do, and the manager will say 40%. Guess what? What you thought you were supposed to be doing isn't what I thought you were supposed to be doing. So again, closing those gaps on thinking, perception, and amazingly, employees and their managers feel really good after those conversations when they're closing the gap. It feels so very different from the conversation of, you didn't do what I thought you were going to do. Right? It's that conversation is like a blame conversation versus an alignment conversation.
Mm. Love that. Thank you so much, Loria. Well, there were a million other things we could have talked about. Unfortunately, we're kind of up on time for today, but just a fascinating, fascinating topic. Once again, the book is Leadership Revolution: The Future of Developing Dynamic Leaders. Highly recommend. So see if you can go and grab a copy of that book. I think you'll learn a lot, even if whether you're a situation where you're trying to develop as a coach, or whether you are trying to develop inside an organization your own management skills, or even if you're just trying to understand how organizations work. There's a whole bunch of really interesting information there, told in a really approachable way. If you're like me, you will have "Wannabe" by the Spice Girls in your head after reading it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you'll learn more about Tai Chi. So many benefits to having this. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today, Laurie.
Oh, thanks so much. And you did such a great read of the book. I feel like you almost know better than I do.
Thank you.